Is it easier to acquire an existing RIA or register a new one? That is today's question on the Transition to RIA question and answer series. It is episode number 141. Hi, I'm Brad Wales with Transition to RIA, where we help you understand everything there is to know about why and how to transition your practice to the RIA model. If you're not already there, head on over to transitiontoria.com. We can find this entire series in video format, podcast format. We have articles, we have white papers, a vendor profile series, all kinds of things to help you better understand the RIA model. Again, transitiontoria.com. Okay, today's episode, probably relatively brief one, but it is something I get asked from time to time, so I wanted to make this episode. And the idea being here, and maybe we'll take it a step back, as I talk about often on these episodes, there's clearly multiple steps involved with potentially exploring an RA path through your practice, let alone actually navigating the transition to it. And one of those decision points is ultimately, hey, should you start your own RIA? Other folks go down a path of joining an existing RIA, and then there's actually a little bit of a flavor in the middle. But if you've gone through that whole exercise, which of course I'm happy to help you think through, and if you've concluded that having your own RIA makes the most sense for your particular practice, that then brings us to today's question is, okay, if that is going to be the case that you're going to have your own RIA, should you register a new RIA, or might it just be simply easier to try to go out of the marketplace and acquire an existing RIA and you're up and going, in theory, quicker or easier, right? Or at least that's the assumption, or that's where the question comes from. So that's what we're going to be talking about here is it better, easier, whatever word you want to use, to acquire that existing RIA or to register a new one? And the short answer, just to cut right to it, I'm going to give you the reasons why. In almost every instance, it is better to register a new RIA than to acquire an existing one. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't potentially acquire an advisory practice, a book of clients from another advisor, and that's perhaps something you do throughout the balance of your career. You might do that multiple times. It's typically not done as part of a transition, right? You already have your practice, you already have your book of clients, and you're looking to transition the arrangement, the setup you have into the RA model. In theory, it could potentially be done. It's typically not, just because that's yet one more moving part. But just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that that's a bad idea, that that's not something you should consider near-term, long-term. But if your thought was, well, I could just get into the RA game and get into my own RA quicker and easier by just acquiring one, and if I can pick up, an additional book of clients as well, hey, that's even better. Again, as I'll explain, that's generally not the path you want to take. So I do want to just go over a couple of the reasons as to why that is the case. So the first thing is, if you acquire an existing RIA, you are acquiring their past. You are acquiring whatever history they have up until that point, and in some ways that could be a lot of good history or a lot of good things that have happened in the past, but you also don't know potentially negative things that have happened in the past. So of particular note is from a regulatory standpoint. So if an RIA has been around any length of time, they likely have gone through one, if not multiple, regulatory exams, and depend on the size, could be by the state or the SEC. And if you're buying that RIA, you're basically buying whatever that track record is. And yes, there's a chance they've perhaps had wonderful exams in the past, which, by the way, if you're going to go down this path, you would want to see what those prior regulatory exams are like. But maybe they didn't, or maybe you're ultimately, no matter how much digging you do, don't discover all of the nuances that might have came of that. And so, for instance, it is typical as part of a regulatory exam that if we'll use the SEC example, that they find certain things during exam, which is possible. The idea being hopefully the small clerical type things that can be relatively easily fixed. it's almost assured that the next time they come back out, they are going to make sure that all of those have been corrected. And if they haven't been corrected, you are going to have significant issues, or they are going to have significant issues with you. And so if something's happened in the past and possibly you're not aware of it, even if you try to dig into it, and all of a sudden now you own this RIA, the SEC shows up again, they're not going to have a whole lot of leniency. They're going to say it's still the same RIA. These things should have already been fixed. Even if you weren't here at the time, you've basically bought into those potential hurdles or challenges from the past. So just from a regulatory standpoint alone of not knowing what baggage there might be, that's a reason to try to essentially maybe start or register your own new RIA instead, where you are started from scratch. You are there on day one going forward. You know exactly what has or has not happened, in this case, from a regulatory perspective. Kind of related to that, another variable to consider is you're also, if you're acquiring an RIA, potentially acquiring past client issues or client complaint issues. And yes, some of those clients might have formally already complained, and hopefully the existing RIA is sharing that information with you and sharing how those issues might have been resolved. But how do you know that some of those clients don't have grievances that are boiling up and they have not formally complained to the RIA yet, and all of a sudden you acquire it, and because of things that you had nothing to do with prior, now they decide to make a complaint, and now it's potentially your issue, potentially your liability. Whereas typically if you're just buying the client book, there's kind of a clean slate there when you start over, that client might still have an issue with the prior RIA, but under the new RIA, which they would have had to agree to come over and join your RIA instead, you basically get a clean slate going forward. So that's another example. You don't know what issues are potentially boiling up with some clients if you're acquiring the whole RIA, acquiring the whole business as a whole. Now, one thing where there could be a benefit, and then I'll point out that although there could be a negative, is if you acquire an existing RIA, you are potentially acquiring a good brand in the marketplace, or maybe a respected brand, or a brand that has a track record, and maybe they've built up an online presence in SEO, search engine optimization for that brand is good. And that's something that can't be achieved overnight. That takes months, if not years sometimes, to build up. And so you might think, wow, if I acquire this, I get all that goodwill, for lack of a better term, and that reputation and whatnot that comes with that. And that might be correct. But again, going back to the unknown, well, how do you know that there's not a bad reputation buried out there somewhere on potentially review sites or message boards, or that people have complained and that there's bad negative news about this RIA that you're not aware of? A seller's probably not going to go out of their way to point that out to you, to say, because that would probably deter you from buying the RIA. And so, yes, there could be good from that kind of reputation brand perspective, but again, knowing there's potential for that uncertainty that could potentially be very damaging, it is another reason to have pause about going the acquisition route. And then there's just the last example, not an exhaustive list, but just wanted to give you a couple things to be thinking about here, is that also if you acquire an RIA, you generally are acquiring whatever contractual obligations they have in place at that point. And so there's all kinds of things that could relate to a lease on an office building or whatnot. But an example is with technology vendors, there are generally contracts in place, and depends on the vendor. Sometimes those contracts are multi-year contracts where if you acquire an RIA, they might have a multi-year contract with perhaps a portfolio management tool, and you might get in there and not like that tool, but you still have 3 years left on the contract you now are essentially are obligated to, and depends on the size of the practice, that sort of tool can be tens of thousands of dollars per year. And so that again is a challenge when you're just acquiring it. You, for better or worse, you're potentially acquiring existing contractual obligations. Whereas if you start an RIA from scratch, and for instance, when it comes time for the tech stack, you are able to piece together whatever technology solutions you want and start from scratch and only go into contractual agreements with solution providers that you like and that you have chosen. So that's just kind of 4 examples of things to be careful about that I hopefully is maybe deterring you from acquiring one versus starting one from scratch. And the way I would just kind of wrap that up is, unlike back in the day, you go back a couple decades ago, it actually was a thing that people would start a broker-dealer in some capacities. Nowadays, it's very rare that new broker-dealers are being started. They are at times, sometimes for specialty purposes, specialty broker-dealer purposes. But if anything, if you look at the statistics, the number of broker-dealers has been continuously shrinking over the years as, among other things, RIAs continue to rise in quantity. But there was a time, if you went back, call it 15 years ago, that if you were trying to build some sort of firm and you thought, well, I need a broker-dealer solution. By the way, I've done all kinds of episodes on how to solve for your legacy commission assets, but there's a time you might have entertained that, and even then you'd have to be quite large of a practice. And that back then it was generally thought of that even with the baggage that I've described here, which would in many cases relate to a broker-dealer as well, that it oftentimes was easier to perhaps acquire a broker-dealer than go through a very long, often costly, time-consuming process to register a new broker-dealer. That's a very high hurdle, very onerous process. Unlike in the RIA world, not that it's a easy process or whatnot, but it's significantly easier, I guess we could use that term, to register a new RIA than it was to register a broker-dealer. So back in the day where perhaps you would acquire a broker-dealer, that was the easier path than trying to start a new one. It's essentially the exact opposite in the RIA space. To register an RIA is not, massively expensive, is not massively time-consuming. There are lots of steps involved. That's a big part of what I help you figure out is, how does all this work? Should you even be going down this path? Should you be starting your own RIA? If that does make sense, what are all those steps to actually get it registered? But it's not some monstrous giant process that is so difficult to overcome that, it might just be easier to buy one. As I'm doing in this episode, I'm arguing the exact opposite. You generally would always want to just start fresh, start your own. Takes a couple months, takes a little money. Happy to walk you through what that would look like for your particular practice and just have that more clean slate start for going forward. So with that, like I said at the top, my name is Brad Wales with Transition to RIA. Helping advisors and teams think through variables such as this is something I do all day long. So in this case, if you concluded, I've walked you through the whole process of how you would come to this conclusion or not of should you have your own RIA? Well, what's the best way to get the RIA registered? And again, should you buy one or just start from fresh? And as I alluded to, what's the process to actually get one registered if you're starting your own? Happy to have that conversation with you as well. But first things first, head on over to the website at transitiontoria.com, where you can find this entire series in video format, podcast format. There's articles, there's white papers, there's a vendor profile series. And at the top of every page is a contact link. Click on that and you can instantly and easily schedule time to have a one-on-one conversation with me, whether you want to talk about today's topic or anything else RIA related. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. Again, transitiontoria.com. And with that, hope you found value in today's episode, and I'll see you on the next one.